So here's a curious problem that I find some people, at the very least, in India, young writers in India, facing. And this has to do with questions that are like, I have this great idea, I don't know how to communicate it in the form of a story. The problem here is that they think that science fiction is about communicating scientific ideas. Now, there was a point of time in the history of science fiction when this was what science fiction was. Uh, Science fiction was treated as a vessel for communicating scientific ideas. But this was in the 60s and 70s, and a lot has happened since then. The new wave of science fiction turned science fiction into an exploration of society and human futures. Social sciences became part of it. So, if most of the science fiction that you're reading happens to be science fiction written by authors, American authors, and Western authors in the 60s and 70s, you are going to think that is what science fiction is supposed to do, or that is what science fiction is. But the truth is, science fiction is, in addition to having the science aspect, it is also fiction. There have to be characters, plot, stories, and all that sort of stuff. So what you really need to do is read living authors, or authors who are closer to you in time than the authors who were writing in the 60s and 70s. People are writing science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction now. Read that so you understand what is happening in the industry, so that when you send a story to a publisher or an editor, you don't sound like someone who's doing what people in the 60s used to do. I think at least part of the reason behind people thinking this way is the whole you must read the classics thing. This is not a problem that afflicts science fiction and fantasy alone, it afflicts a wide variety of literature where often it is assumed that there was something fundamentally good about stories that are described as classics. Like you must read Falana author who was writing in the 60s and 70s because they had a huge impact on science fiction. I'm not saying you should not read them. I'm just saying कि give up this idea that there was something necessarily and fundamentally and unavoidably worthy of emulation in those stories. They were good stories and they have survived because they have a continued appeal, but they don't necessarily teach you something or anything that stories being written and published today cannot. In fact, many stories that are being written today are going to be treated like classics in 30, 40 years from now. And even then, this advice would be valuable. If you are a writer who's writing science fiction, fantasy, or really anything, you should read people who are alive and writing right now. Or at the very least, people who are closer to the social circumstances in which you exist right now.